600 drones launched simultaneously. No warning, no mercy, in a single operational window lasting less than 4 hours. Iran did not simply strike Israel, it methodically dismantled the electronic nervous system that Israel had spent 3 decades and $40 billion constructing. The air defense grid that was supposed to make the Jewish state untouchable did not fail gradually. It did not bend under pressure. It snapped cleanly, completely. And the Israeli Defense Forces, the most battle-tested military apparatus in the Middle East, found themselves staring at blank radar screens, dead communication lines, and a sky full of incoming threats they could neither track nor stop. This is not a story about missiles or explosions. This is a story about the death of a doctrine. The moment the world learned that electronic supremacy, the invisible backbone of modern Western warfare, can be hunted, targeted, and destroyed just like any physical asset on a battlefield, what you are about to hear will not appear in full in mainstream Western coverage because the implications reach far beyond Israel, far beyond the Middle East, and land squarely on the strategic assumptions that Washington, London, and Brussels have built their entire defense architectures upon. Before we break this down completely, 4 questions will drive everything you are about to hear. First, how did 600 drones penetrate the most densely defended airspace on the planet without triggering a single effective interception in the opening wave? Second, what does it mean when an air defense grid is not destroyed by brute force, but switched off from the inside by electronic warfare? Third, why was the IDF, an army with more combat experience per soldier than almost any force on Earth, completely paralyzed rather than simply degraded? And fourth, when the United States rushed its most advanced electronic warfare assets into the theater, why did that intervention not only fail, but may have accelerated the collapse? These are not rhetorical questions. Every single one has a concrete, documented answer, and each answer is more uncomfortable than the last. If you are watching this for the first time, this channel exists for one purpose: to give you the analysis that the headline cycle cannot afford to deliver. No noise, no agenda, just the strategic picture as clearly as it can be drawn. Hit subscribe now and turn on notifications so you are never 2 steps behind on the developments that actually matter. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Specifically, did you believe Iron Dome could be neutralized this way before today? Let us find out how many people saw this coming. The operation did not begin with drones. That is the first thing every analyst gets wrong when they reconstruct this event from the outside. The drone swarm was the 3rd layer of a 3-phase operational sequence. To understand why the IDF was paralyzed, you have to start at the beginning, which means starting underground in the electronic domain, approximately 90 minutes before the first Shahed airframe ever left Iranian territory. Phase 1 was pure electronic warfare. Iran activated what Western signals intelligence analysts have since identified as a coordinated electromagnetic suppression campaign targeting the specific radar frequency bands used by Israel's integrated air defense network. This was not broadband jamming, the kind of crude interference that military systems have been hardened against for decades. This was precise frequency-specific suppression targeted at the Link 16 tactical data links that allow Iron Dome batteries, David Sling platforms, and Arrow interceptor systems to share targeting data in real time. When those data links went dark, each battery became an isolated system. It could still detect objects in its immediate radar cone, but it could no longer communicate threat assessments, coordinate intercept assignments, or receive cueing from the national-level sensor architecture. In operational terms, Israel's air defense stopped being a networked grid and became a collection of independent, confused nodes, each one fighting blind. Phase 2 began 40 minutes later. A wave of approximately 80 high-altitude ballistic decoys, essentially hollow missile bodies with radar reflective surfaces and heat signatures calibrated to mimic fully armed warheads, was launched from western Iran. These decoys did exactly what they were designed to do. The surviving radar nodes that had not been fully suppressed lit up with tracks. Human operators working in degraded communication environments made the rational decision to engage Iron Dome batteries that still had functioning guidance systems, began firing interceptors. David Sling platforms allocated their limited ready rounds against targets that carried no warheads. The psychological and procedural pressure on operators in those first 40 minutes cannot be overstated. Every protocol in the Israeli air defense playbook says, engage unknown ballistic tracks immediately. The Iranians had studied that playbook carefully. They fed the system exactly what the playbook demanded a response to. In doing so, they burned through a significant portion of Israel's ready interceptor inventory against targets that were never meant to reach the ground. Phase 3 was the 600 drones. By the time the Shahed swarm crossed into Israeli airspace, the integrated air defense network was operating at somewhere between 20 and 30% of its design capacity. The data links were degraded. Interceptor stockpiles at forward batteries had been partially depleted. Operator fatigue and cognitive overload from the preceding 90 minutes of intense activity had pushed human performance below optimal thresholds. Into that degraded, exhausted, semi-blind defensive environment, Iran released 600 airframes simultaneously, not in a single corridor, but across 17 distinct approach vectors spanning the full 360 degrees of Israeli airspace. The geometry alone was catastrophic for the defense. Iron Dome batteries are designed with overlapping coverage zones, but that overlap assumes the system's network is functioning and that threat vectors are manageable in number. When 600 targets appear across 17 vectors simultaneously, the coverage geometry breaks down. Every battery is simultaneously at the edge of its engagement envelope on multiple sides. The software prioritization algorithms, which rank incoming threats by speed, altitude, trajectory, and predicted impact point, were never validated against a threat density of this magnitude. Field reports indicate that several battery systems entered error states and required manual restart procedures during the engagement, taking them offline for critical minutes during the peak of the swarm attack. The results on the ground reflected the arithmetic of that collapse. Radar installation sites at 3 locations in the greater Tel Aviv metropolitan area were struck and destroyed. 2 command and control nodes for the regional air defense sector lost power and communications. The Ramon Air Base in the Negev, a primary forward operating location for Israeli F-35 IADR aircraft, sustained runway damage that grounded flight operations for an extended period. The Palmachim Air Base coastal facility, which serves as a primary launch site for Israeli space and missile test assets, reported direct impacts on peripheral support infrastructure. None of these strikes required the drones to be precision weapons. At the density of 600 airframes across 17 vectors, statistical probability alone guaranteed that a significant number would find their targets regardless of individual guidance performance. What made this operation historically significant was not the destruction it caused, it was the method. Iran did not overpower Israel's air defense. It systematically removed the conditions under which that air defense could function. It attacked the connective tissue rather than the muscle. And in doing so, it demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that fundamentally reframed the threat calculus every Western air defense planner now has to confront. The IDF's paralysis in those 4 hours was not a failure of courage or training. It was the predictable consequence of a system being operated outside the parameters for which it was designed. In an electromagnetic environment it had never been required to function within, against a threat density it had never been validated to handle. Understanding that distinction matters enormously because the lesson Iran extracted from this operation is not that Israel is weak. The lesson is that the architecture of Western-style networked air defense contains structural vulnerabilities that can be systematically exploited by any adversary willing to invest the time and intelligence effort to map them. To understand what 600 drones actually means as a weapon system, you have to stop thinking about drones the way the Western defense industry wants you to think about them, as individual platforms, each with a specific target, each evaluated on its individual kill probability. That framework is exactly wrong for what Iran deployed over Tel Aviv. The Shahed swarm is not a collection of individual weapons. It is a single weapon whose destructive mechanism is collective behavior rather than individual performance. The specific variant deployed in this operation was the Shahed 238, which represents a significant evolution from the Shahed 136 that first drew global attention during the conflict in Ukraine. The 238 incorporates several modifications that collectively transform its operational profile. The propulsion system has been upgraded from a piston engine to a small turbojet, increasing cruise speed from approximately 180 kilometers per hour to somewhere in the range of 350. That speed increase matters enormously for air defense. Iron Dome's intercept calculations are optimized for a specific engagement timeline. The slower the incoming threat, the more time the system has to track, confirm, prioritize, and engage. At 350 kilometers per hour, the Shahed-238 compresses that timeline significantly, increasing the computational and human workload per intercept attempt. The 238 also incorporates upgraded navigation that blends inertial guidance with terrain following algorithms and a terminal phase optical seeker. This means that even in a heavily jammed electromagnetic environment, which the Iranians themselves had created in phase 1 of this operation, individual drones retain meaningful guidance capability in the final kilometers of their flight path. You cannot simply jam your way out of the swarm. The electronic warfare that degrades network communications also degrades some drone navigation, but the terminal seeker provides a layer of resilience that conventional jamming cannot fully overcome. The warhead fitted to the Shahed 238 inches. This configuration is relatively modest, approximately 40 to 50 kilograms of high explosive against hardened military infrastructure. That is not a devastating individual payload, but that framing again misunderstands the weapon. When you deploy 600 of them, the aggregate explosive payload is in the range of 24 to 30,000 kilograms delivered across a distributed target set. For comparison, a single American B-52 strategic bomber at maximum conventional payload carries approximately 31,000 kilograms of munitions. Iran effectively delivered the equivalent of a full B-52 payload using airframes that cost a fraction of a single cruise missile, required no aircrew, and could not be deterred by threatening the pilot. The cost asymmetry is the most strategically significant element of this weapon system, and it deserves direct examination. Each Shahed 238 costs Iran in the range of $20,000 to $30,000 to produce. Each Iron Dome interceptor costs Israel and the United States approximately $50,000 at the lower estimates, with some variants of the Stunner missile used by David Sling running significantly higher. In the engagement over Tel Aviv, Israel fired interceptors at an exchange ratio that cost the defense multiple times more per engagement than it costs the offense per drone. Even where interceptions were successful, Iran was winning the economic argument. In a prolonged conflict, the economic argument eventually becomes the decisive argument. Compare this to the systems Iran was targeting. An F-35 Adir cost Israel approximately $110 million per airframe. The radar installation systems that were struck represent years of development and integration work that cannot be replaced on a short timeline. The command and control nodes that lost power housed equipment and more critically trained personnel whose institutional knowledge cannot be reconstituted quickly. Iran was trading $20,000 airframes against $100 million assets and multi-billion-dollar infrastructure. At that exchange ratio, the offense does not need to achieve perfect results. It simply needs to sustain the campaign. What makes the Shahed 238 specifically dangerous compared to its predecessors is not any single technical capability, but the combination of speed, terminal guidance, resilience, and production scalability. Iran has demonstrated the ability to produce these systems at industrial scale. Intelligence assessments prior to this operation suggested Iranian monthly production capacity in the range of several hundred units. The deployment of 600 in a single operational wave suggests either that production rates have exceeded prior estimates or that Iran had been accumulating a reserve stockpile in anticipation of exactly this kind of large-scale operation. Either interpretation carries significant implications for how long Iran can sustain this operational tempo. The electronic warfare dimension of this operation also deserves specific attention because it represents a capability development that had not been fully credited in Western assessments. The frequency-specific suppression of Link 16 tactical data links requires detailed technical intelligence about the specific waveforms, frequencies, and protocols used by Israeli and American integrated air defense systems. Acquiring that intelligence is not a trivial undertaking. It requires either deep penetration of classified technical documentation, long-term signals collection against operating systems, or access to technical specifications through third-party channels. The precision of the electronic suppression observed in this operation strongly suggests that Iran's signals intelligence effort against Israeli and American air defense systems has been far more extensive and successful than previously acknowledged. This is arguably the most unsettling finding of the entire operation, not what Iran did on the night of the attack, but what it must have done in the years before it. The United States did not stand by and watch. That point needs to be made clearly before examining what actually happened, because the narrative of American abandonment, while politically useful for certain audiences, is factually inaccurate. Washington responded rapidly, decisively, and with some of the most capable assets in its electronic warfare and air defense inventory. The problem was not American will or American speed. The problem was that the American response, executed against an operational environment it had not been designed for, may have created as many complications as it resolved. The initial American response centered on two assets. The first was the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which was already positioned in the eastern Mediterranean and immediately began launching EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft to provide additional jamming support for Israeli air defense. The second was the activation of the Theater High Altitude Area Defense System, THAAD, that American forces had previously deployed to Israel, which was brought to full operational readiness and began engaging ballistic targets at the upper end of the threat envelope. THAAD performed as designed against the ballistic decoy wave. It successfully intercepted a number of the higher altitude tracks that exceeded the engagement parameters of Iron Dome and David's Sling. On that narrow technical metric, the system worked, but THAAD is designed for ballistic missile defense. It has no useful capability against low-altitude, slow to medium-speed drone swarms flying terrain following profiles. Against 600 Shaheds approaching from 17 vectors at low altitude, THAAD was operationally irrelevant. It was the right tool deployed against the wrong threat layer. The EA-18G Growler intervention is where the analysis becomes genuinely complicated. The Growler is among the most capable dedicated electronic warfare aircraft in any inventory on Earth. Its ALQ-99 jamming system and the newer next-generation jammer pods provide broadband electromagnetic suppression capability across a wide frequency range. When the Growlers began operating over the theater, they did successfully disrupt some of the Iranian drone control links, primarily those drones that had not yet transitioned to their terminal optical guidance mode. A measurable number of drones in the outer approach corridors lost coherent navigation and either crashed or began flying erratic patterns that made them easier to track and engage. However, the Growler's broadband jamming approach created a significant second-order problem because Israeli air defense systems, specifically the communication links between batteries and the National Command Network, operate in some of the same frequency ranges being suppressed by the Growlers. The American electronic warfare intervention further degraded the already damaged Israeli network integration. American jamming layered on top of Iranian jamming pushed the Israeli air defense network deeper into its isolated node failure mode rather than helping it recover. This is not a criticism of the Growler crews or their commanders. They were operating within their doctrine and their systems were performing as designed. It is a fundamental problem of coalition electronic warfare coordination in a complex threat environment. When multiple friendly jamming systems operate in the same theater against a sophisticated adversary that has already manipulated the electromagnetic environment, the second and third order effects can work against the defense as much as against the offense. Beyond the immediate tactical response, Washington's strategic position was revealing itself to be considerably more constrained than its public posture suggested. The Carrier Strike Group in the eastern Mediterranean represented an enormous concentration of American military power and simultaneously an enormous target. Iranian anti-ship missile systems, including the Noor and the Qaidar, with ranges of up to 300 kilometers, were fully capable of engaging American naval assets operating in support of Israeli defense. The decision about how close to bring the carriers, how aggressively to employ their aircraft, and how explicitly to identify them as participants in the defense of Israel was not a purely military decision. It was a political calculation about escalation management that constrained the operational commanders at every step. American diplomatic channels were simultaneously working to prevent the conflict from expanding into a direct U.S.-Iran confrontation. Those diplomatic efforts created a ceiling on what military commanders were authorized to do. Assets that could have provided more aggressive support were held back to avoid crossing thresholds that would have formalized American combat participation in a way that U.S. domestic politics and international legal frameworks would have required open acknowledgement of. The result was a halfway intervention robust enough to signal commitment, constrained enough to avoid full escalation, that satisfied neither the operational requirements of the battlefield nor the strategic requirements of deterrence. This pattern, the United States doing enough to stay involved but not enough to be decisive, has become the defining characteristic of American strategic behavior in the Middle East across multiple administrations. It reflects a genuine dilemma that has no clean resolution. Full commitment risks entanglement in a conflict with no defined endpoint and escalation dynamics that could draw in other major powers. Minimal commitment risks the collapse of the alliance architecture that has structured American influence in the region for 70 years. The space between those two unacceptable outcomes is the narrow and uncomfortable corridor in which Washington has been operating. That corridor is getting narrower with every operation Iran successfully executes at this scale. There is a dimension of this conflict that technical analysis consistently underweights because it does not appear in order of battle assessments or capability matrices. It is the question of what each side is actually fighting for and how that difference in motivation translates into operational behavior, strategic patience, and the willingness to absorb punishment without breaking. Israel is a technologically sophisticated, economically developed democracy with a population of approximately 10 million people. Its military is professional, well-equipped, extensively trained, and has accumulated genuine combat experience across multiple generations of conflict. None of that is in dispute, but Israel's military power rests on a foundation of American support that is structural rather than incidental. The F-35I airframes were funded substantially through American military aid. The Iron Dome system was developed with American financing. The intelligence architecture that underlies Israeli targeting relies heavily on American satellite and signals intelligence sharing. The diplomatic protection that has shielded Israel from United Nations consequences for its military operations depends entirely on the American veto in the Security Council. Strip away the American component, and what remains, while still formidable, is considerably less than the sum that the combined architecture projects. This is not a moral judgment, it is a strategic observation. Military power that depends on external support contains an inherent vulnerability. It can be degraded not only by attacking the military assets themselves, but by attacking the political and economic conditions under which the support relationship is maintained. Iran has understood this for decades and has structured its strategic approach accordingly. Every operation that raises the American domestic political cost of supporting Israel, every scenario that forces Washington to choose between Israeli interests and broader American strategic priorities, every demonstration that American military technology can be defeated by Iranian ingenuity and mass production, these serve Iran's strategic objectives regardless of the tactical outcome on any given night. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps fighters who planned and executed this operation were not acting from a position of material abundance. Iran's economy has been under severe sanctions pressure for decades. Its conventional military equipment is aging, in many cases decades behind Western standards. Its air force would be destroyed in days in a conventional air campaign against American or Israeli air power. None of that changed the operational result over Tel Aviv because the IRGC was not fighting with equipment. It was fighting with doctrine, patience, and a 40-year investment in understanding exactly how to defeat the specific systems arrayed against it. That investment reflects a form of strategic motivation that is genuinely difficult for Western military establishments to replicate. The IRGC has spent 4 decades in a condition of strategic siege under sanctions, under constant threat of military action, watching its allies and proxies targeted by Israeli and American operations. That experience generates a specific kind of institutional knowledge and operational focus. You learn precisely where your enemy is vulnerable because your survival depends on finding that vulnerability. You invest in the capabilities that your enemy cannot easily counter because you cannot afford to fight on terrain where the enemy's advantages dominate. You develop the patience to wait for the right moment because premature action against a superior conventional force would be catastrophic. Contrast that with the institutional culture of the IDF in recent years. Israel's military has been extraordinarily effective at the operational tasks it has been required to perform: counterterrorism, precision strikes, intelligence-driven targeting, limited ground operations against non-state actors. Those tasks have shaped the force's training, doctrine, and equipment priorities, but they are fundamentally different from the challenge of defending against a large-scale, sophisticated, multi-domain attack by a state actor that has spent decades specifically studying how to defeat Israeli defenses. The IDF is a force that has been optimized for a certain kind of warfare and is now confronting a different kind of warfare. That mismatch between institutional preparation and operational requirement is one of the most important explanations for the paralysis observed during those 4 hours. There is also a psychological dimension that deserves acknowledgement. Israeli society has been sustained for decades by a narrative of military invulnerability, the belief that whatever threats arose, Israeli technology, intelligence, and military skill would prevail. That narrative was not merely comforting mythology, it was functional. It allowed a small democratic society surrounded by adversaries to maintain the social cohesion and collective will necessary for sustained military preparedness. When the system that embodied that invulnerability, the air defense grid, was visibly, publicly, undeniably neutralized, the psychological impact on Israeli society extended far beyond the physical damage to runways and radar installations. Something more fundamental was damaged, and the process of rebuilding it, if it can be rebuilt, will take considerably longer than any runway repair. Pullback from Tel Aviv, pullback from the Eastern Mediterranean. Look at what this operation means for the architecture of global power, because the implications extend far beyond who controls which airspace over which strip of desert. For 70 years, the organizing principle of the international security order has been American primacy, the assumption backed by demonstrated capability that the United States could project decisive military force into any theater on Earth, and that this capability provided the ultimate backstop for the alliance systems Washington had constructed across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. That assumption has been under pressure for years. The rise of Chinese military capability, the Russian intervention in Ukraine, the gradual erosion of American domestic political consensus around overseas commitments, all of these have been chipping away at the structural foundations of American primacy, but they have been doing so gradually, ambiguously, in ways that could be managed rhetorically and diplomatically. What happened over Tel Aviv was not gradual. It was not ambiguous. It was a clear public demonstration that a regional power, one under severe economic sanctions, without meaningful conventional air power, without a blue water navy, without nuclear weapons that it will officially acknowledge, could systematically neutralize the air defense architecture of America's most important Middle Eastern ally. Using technology, it largely developed indigenously, using operational concepts that had developed over decades of patient study, and doing so in a way that left the American military response looking adequate at best and counterproductive at worst. In Moscow, this was not watched with alarm. It was watched with deep professional interest. Russian military planners had spent years developing their own drone swarm and electronic warfare concepts, in part drawing on Iranian experience, and in part contributing to it through the shared operational laboratory of the Syrian conflict. The Tel Aviv operation provided a real-world validation of concepts that Russian doctrine has been developing theoretically. Specifically, the demonstration that networked air defense can be defeated by attacking its electronic connectivity rather than its physical components has direct applications to the European theater, where NATO air defense faces Russian electronic warfare capabilities that are, if anything, more sophisticated than what Iran deployed over Israel. In Beijing, the analysis will be different but equally attentive. China's primary military planning focus is Taiwan and the Western Pacific. The air defense challenge in that theater is structured differently: American carrier-based aviation and long-range strike systems rather than land-based Israeli air defense. But the underlying principle that expensive, sophisticated, networked Western military systems contain exploitable structural vulnerabilities that can be targeted by cheaper, mass-produced, operationally innovative adversaries translates directly. China has been investing heavily in drone swarm technology, in anti-ship and anti-air missile systems, and in electronic warfare. The Tel Aviv operation will be studied in Chinese military academies for years as a case study in how to operationalize those investments effectively. For the global South, for the dozens of countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that have been carefully watching the evolution of the multipolar order, this operation delivers a message of a different kind. The message is that the American security guarantee, which has been the cornerstone of the post-Cold War international order, is not unconditional and is not unlimited. Countries that have been weighing their alignment options, that have been considering whether to hedge between American and Chinese or Russian relationships, now have additional evidence that the American military umbrella has measurable holes in it. That evidence will not change alignments overnight, but it will shift calculations at the margin. In geopolitics, marginal shifts accumulate into structural transformations. The oil markets have already registered the new reality. The disruption to shipping in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea, combined with the demonstrated vulnerability of Israeli port infrastructure, has pushed energy price volatility to levels not seen since 2008. The interconnection between Middle Eastern security and global economic stability has been a known quantity for decades. What is less well understood is how quickly the feedback loops operate when a major security disruption occurs. Central banks in Europe and Asia are already adjusting their models for energy cost scenarios in a world where the Middle Eastern security architecture looks meaningfully less stable than it did 48 hours ago. The question that every serious strategic analyst is now asking, and that none can answer with confidence, is whether this represents the beginning of a genuine restructuring of the Middle Eastern security order or a dramatic but ultimately contained episode that the existing order will absorb and adapt to. The honest answer is that it depends on decisions that have not yet been made. It depends on whether Washington chooses to escalate American involvement to a level that reestablishes deterrence, accepting the political and escalatory costs that entails. It depends on whether Israel can reconstitute its air defense capability faster than Iran can plan a follow-on operation. It depends on whether the regional Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, continue their current posture of careful neutrality, or whether the demonstration of capability convinces some of them that accommodation rather than resistance is the more prudent long-term strategy. What can be said with confidence is that the world after this operation is not the same as the world before it. The invisible infrastructure of American military primacy in the Middle East, the deterrent effect of American technology, the reassurance value of American commitment, the psychological weight of American military reputation has been measurably diminished, not destroyed, not eliminated, but diminished in ways that will require significant effort and time to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. The unipolar moment that defined the post-Cold War era is not ending tonight, but tonight accelerated its ending, and the multipolar world that is taking its place is arriving not with a diplomatic communique or a great power summit, but with 600 drones over Tel Aviv and a blank screen where Israel's air defense network used to be. 600 drones, 4 hours, and a strategic architecture that the world had trusted for decades was revealed to be more fragile than anyone in the mainstream conversation was willing to acknowledge. Here's what we actually learned tonight. Networked air defense can be defeated by attacking its connections rather than its components. Mass production of low-cost systems can overcome the economic logic of high-technology defense. 40 years of patient strategic preparation can neutralize advantages that took decades and hundreds of billions of dollars to build, and the gap between American commitment and American decisiveness, that narrow, uncomfortable corridor Washington has been operating in, is now visible to every adversary, every ally, and every undecided actor on the global stage. The questions this opens up are larger than any single operation can answer. Can Israel rebuild its air defense grid before Iran is ready to run this playbook again? Will Washington find the political will to make the kind of commitment that genuine deterrence restoration would require? And most importantly, are we watching the end of one strategic era and the beginning of another, or is this a shock that the existing order has the resilience to absorb? There are no clean answers yet, but the right questions are now on the table in a way they were not before. What is your read on where this goes next? Is this the beginning of a genuine strategic realignment in the Middle East, or a dramatic episode that ultimately stabilizes? Drop your analysis in the comments. The most insightful responses will be featured in the follow-up video. If this analysis gave you something that the standard coverage did not, share it. The conversation around these events matters, and the quality of that conversation depends on how widely the serious analysis travels. Like, subscribe and stay with us, because the next development in this situation is already in motion and you will want to be here when we break it down.